And welcome, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. But when it comes to ordinances, they say we do this because they're commanded to do it. And then you say, well, why? Why would our Lord command us to do these specific things? And many times Protestants just don't have an answer to that. It's like, well, we have the crackers and grape juice because the matzah, there's the griddle marks, which remind us of the stripes Jesus bore. And they try to pull out symbolism that actually isn't even there in the text, just trying to make sense of, well, why these particular things? Why would our Lord command it if it doesn't do anything?
All these seemingly arbitrary aspects of the law only to replace them with new, really arbitrary things. Isn't that kind of strange?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what's even stranger is how much if you're blind to the Catholic teaching on the Eucharist, or it's just foreign to you, or it's just something that's never crossed your mind, all these passages that Catholics take for granted as being Eucharistic don't seem Eucharistic to you. So, for instance, and you run into this all the time when you're talking to a Christian from any denomination on the planet who's taken issue with something that Catholics believe. Mm-hmm. If they want to find the biblical basis for something, they're like, okay, baptism. Let's do a word study, right? Let's get out the concordance, the Strong's Concordance, look up how many times the word baptism comes up and what people say about it. What does Paul say about it? Except when the Catholic Church talks about about baptism, if you look at the Fathers or if you look at the baptism rite, they're talking about Noah. They're talking about Naaman the Syrian. They're talking about the Spirit hovering over the waters in creation. They're talking about the people of Israel crossing through the waters of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They're talking about all this other stuff. And the Eucharist is the same way. Yeah. Once you realize what it is and what it symbolizes, and what beyond just what it symbolizes, it's a symbol that is what it signifies. Right? Then things start to jump out to you, from the manna in the desert, which is one of the examples Jesus himself uses to talk about the Eucharist, to the whole Passover sacrifice and what that means, because that's not something that we necessarily would have connected. We would have said that Jesus is commemorating the escape to Egypt, not necessarily the slaying of the lamb.
Yeah.
It's interesting in a lot of ways, because the stuff that you just don't see, because nobody's ever really told you, given you that particular hermeneutic to look at the scriptures and particularly salvation history in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, I had William Albrecht on earlier in the week. We were talking about the sacrifice of the Mass. And one point he made was, if you're a New Testament Christian and that's all you look at, the sacrificial language doesn't really jump out at you, but when you take the whole Old Testament and bring it to bear on those texts, then it's like in Technicolor.
Yeah. What is this? There are a number of ways that this started to kind of make sense to me. I believed it before I felt it. I was one of those people where my mind was converted on the Eucharist before my heart really caught up. Uh-huh. But one of the things that was part of that was this realization that what is the central event in the Old Testament? What is the event that gets talked about in almost every book of the Old Testament? Remember that I delivered you out of the land of Egypt. The central event in the Old Testament is the Exodus. Well, what's the central event of the Exodus? It's the Passover, right? And this is something that was crucial to Jewish worship. This is what the Hebrew children are. This is what their whole identity comes from. There's a reason that the Ten Commandments is everybody's favorite movie, whether Jewish or Christian or whatever. It's because it's all of our story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And so you were converted more from the head, just looking at the biblical data, and then eventually your heart caught up. I mean, was it after you came into? Well, it must have happened before you came into the church.
It did happen before. Some people will walk into the Catholic Church for the first time and they'll see the priest elevate the host, and they'll say, have that Thomas in the upper room moment where they say, "My Lord and my God," and they just know. For me, it was more like, I had kind of figured all this stuff out before I ever visited Mass for the first time. Yeah. And it was a very different thing than what I'd read about. But I mention all the time about how pivotal Flannery O'Connor was in sort of renewing my imagination. And I think the line from her, one of her letters, where she's talking about being at some late night dinner with a bunch of people. She didn't have much to say to the room. And then at one point late in the evening, one of these kind of well-to-do sort of former Catholic Episcopalian ladies says, I don't really, do the whole Catholic thing, but that, the bread and the wine, that's a comforting symbol, I think. And Flannery O'Connor in her only line of the night just says, well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. That resonated with me almost more than any argument. Just because of, that's one of those choose you this day kind of lines. It's like It's like a liar lunatic Lord's sort of presentation of what the Eucharist is. Either it is what we believed it is as Christians until it was disputed in the 16th century, or it's not. Yeah. And there's so many ways to discuss this. How is it possible? Because a lot of this was logic for me. How is it possible that when God says, "Let there be light," there is light, but when Jesus, who is God, says, "This is my body," nothing happens? That's the kind of stuff that sort of you have to mull over once you start to think about these things.
Right. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, that point was recognized by the early reformers. It's either if the Mass is true and Christ is present, then to worship him is worship, in the truest sense. And if it isn't, then it's the worst possible blasphemy. As
That's what John Calvin said. He said that the Mass is the highest form of idolatry.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
You're worshiping the stuff of earth.
Yeah, and you kind of echoed Augustine. It's Augustine said we don't sin by adoring it, but we do sin by not adoring it. Not adoring Christ's body and blood.
Yeah, it's interesting too because when I discovered that Catholics did daily Mass, I had an objection that a lot of people have, and when I sort of discovered the repetitive nature of Catholic liturgy. You start to think, well, this is just going to make people get used to it. So, but interestingly enough, John Wesley wrote a piece that will occasionally get brought up in like